So I just wanted to make a few quick remarks about the Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, Yaron Brook and Greg Salmieri discussion that happened recently. So this promised to be an interesting encounter given Yaron and the objectivists' view on economics. And so I was really looking for some interesting discussion based around the ideas that seem to be percolating at the moment with respect to people losing their jobs and automation is coming, and so what do we do as a society if people start losing their jobs? And or just some of the discussion about collectivism when it comes to economics and how to maintain social cohesion when we have such divergent views about the role of the individual when it comes to creating wealth. None of these economic discussions were ever broached. We never really got into the real area of expertise that I think the objectivists do have and have something to teach people. Instead, we got bogged down on questions of epistemology. Now, of course, I'm interested in epistemology, and I like listening to discussions that people have about various kinds of ways in which they think that knowledge is formed. But it's a little frustrating. It's frustrating when we don't have a voice that can clearly articulate some of the ways in which we know knowledge is constructed. Instead, we have people's pet ideas or ways in which people might have reasoned through these issues themselves. Let's just listen to what some of them say.
One of you figure out a way out of that. I mean, that right? That would be the answer that an objectivist would want to have, right? Here we are. We got a whole bunch of them right in front of you.
So, I don't think you could have a list of rules if the rule you mean something like an algorithm that you live your life by.
Exactly.
And I think that's just not something we can do. That's not the way the human mind works, and the world is complicated, and you're not going to get a bunch of if-then statements that take you to. I mean, you can't even do that for a lot of physical systems to its length.
Right.
But I think we can understand them rationally. Now, this might be similar to what we were talking about in the green room about Sam's view of reason and yours and mine. We might got to figure out where they all lie. But I don't think reason is just about coming up with algorithms. I think we come up with concepts. Concepts enable us to assimilate vast quantities of similar things to one another and learn from about future instances from past ones. We can get quite subtle.
So we can learn about future instances from past ones. Now, he said there that there was some interesting differences perhaps between himself as an objectivist and Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris when it comes to this concept of reason and what reason means. Now, what we might hear in a moment is how the objectivist conception of reason is very, very broad. And it's so broad an umbrella that almost anything done with the human mind might be considered reason so long as it doesn't lead into irrationality. On the other hand, what we hear from Jordan is that his conception of reason is something similar to logic. It's almost synonymous with logic. It's the ability to think in a mathematical type way to get from one claim to another in such a way as that it's valid. It doesn't allow for anything beyond deduction, as far as I can tell. What Sam and Jordan and Greg here and even Yaron all appreciate, and indeed what Popperians appreciate as well, is that deduction cannot possibly be the way that knowledge is generated. All that deduction allows you to do is to figure out what claim follows logically from whatever set of axioms you're starting with, or from whatever previous claims that you've made. So you have these rules of inference that you follow, and if you follow them, then you're liable to end up not producing errors that you would have if you hadn't followed them. So logic is kind of an error-correcting mechanism. It's a way of thinking through the consequences of the ideas that you have. But it can't create the ideas in the first place. And this has been a historic problem for philosophers of science since anyone's been thinking about these issues. Given that deduction is a way in which you ensure that the conclusions you have are valid given some set of premises that you have, how is it that you get the premises in the first place? How is it that you arrive at these ideas that you think are correct or that solve a particular problem in the first place? The solution to this has traditionally been that if deduction doesn't work, induction must work. So we invent a new word, because deduction just allows us to show how specific instances are correct given some general principle. So once we have the general principle, then we can determine what follows from those general principles. In particular, how do we apply it to specific situations? We've got the general idea, we encounter a specific situation, deduction allows us to apply that general rule to a specific situation. But as for coming up with the general rule in the first place, the very purpose of science, deduction's no help. So therefore, the only answer traditionally that's been offered is this thing called induction. And induction is where you simply go out into the world, you observe reality, and from it, you somehow read the general rule. And usually it's as simple as extrapolating. You generalize. You see the same thing happen a number of times, and you just presume that it will continue to happen. My favourite example here has always been the boiling of water. You boil water for 4 minutes, and every single minute it climbs by 20 degrees Celsius. Then you expect on the 5th minute it will climb by another 20 degrees Celsius. And so you have a rule that applying this amount of heat for this amount of time causes a rise in temperature of 20 degrees Celsius. Of course, if you think that is a rule that is valid to draw, valid to extrapolate, given the set of observations, then you're liable to think that water is going to continue to rise in temperature no matter how long you heat it. But anyone who's actually bothered to heat water will know that once you get to the boiling point of water, usually about 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, the temperature no longer rises. The temperature, even though you're heating the water, remains at 100 degrees Celsius. And no amount of observing past instances of water increasing in temperature upon the application of heat could ever have told you that. So we have a problem. And we have a problem that merely observing things in the world, even if a pattern is being followed, cannot possibly give us the general rules that govern the world. That's not the way it works. The Popperian said, or Karl Popper tried to explain, that induction can't be the way in which we generate theories. Now, he did say that if you want to demarcate science from the rest of science, forget about trying to confirm things via some sort of inductive validation. Instead, what you should be trying to do is to refute your theory where you can. And so this was the line of demarcation. And he never argued that this kind of experimental refutation was a straightforward thing. Instead, it's highly complex, and there are ways in which your attempts at refutation, when they appear to be refutations, when they appear to be falsifications, might not be. Popper covered all this. But more importantly for this particular discussion, we do not have an answer as to how we arrive at these creative conjectures in the first place. We know that we do. We know that we human beings are unique, so far as we can tell in the universe, at being able to conjecture solutions to problems we encounter, to explain the world around us, to reflect the reality that's out there within our own minds. But that act of reflecting what is out there in here is not an act of reading, which is the kind of sense we're going to get in a moment. This idea that somehow the facts of reality are there, and if only we could decipher them, then we'd have access to the ontological truth. We would derive the ontological truth. But this is not the way it works. Reality's a mess. It's out there. It's outside of our minds. And so our minds have to conjecture, to create what it is that's happening out there in language, using symbols, in our interactions with one another. What we try and do is to conjure the symbols and the language in such a way as to explain, to reflect, to replicate the reality that's out there in our explanations. Our explanations become a part of reality, independent of us, but they arose from within us and then are tested against the external reality. But they are not read from the reality. And this is the mistake, I think, that we will hear from Jordan and from our objectivist philosophers. And it's the kind of mistake you do tend to hear from Sam Harris. You hear it from anyone who's not a Popperian. This idea that because reality is objective, out there beyond our minds, and we all agree on that, that this means that somehow or other we need to have a process of reading directly from the book of reality, as though science were written in the language of maths, as it is sometimes said. But this simply isn't the case. Mathematics, like any other language that we use to describe reality, is something that we have created. And yes, once we've created it, it has an independent reality of its own. But this should not be to say that there is some kind of one-to-one correspondence between the creations that we have in order to explain the world, namely our knowledge, and the reality itself. The links between the knowledge that we have and the ontological reality that's out there are conjectures. They're fallible conjectures. They need to be refined and changed and sometimes completely overturned. We can be absolutely wrong about the connection between our knowledge and the thing that it is knowledge of, or the thing that it's attempting to explain. Those things can be mistaken. It's always the case.
Principles, but I think moral principles are not things that take the form of simple rules. Don't lie. They're, to take Rand's version of the virtue of honesty, which isn't don't lie, it's your recognition of the fact that what's unreal is unreal and it can't be of value. So faking things won't work. It won't make them real. Somehow the thing you fake is going to come back to haunt you. That's not a simple rule of what to do in each situation. It's a kind of broad fact that you can use to steer your life by. And in order to use it to steer your life by and to fully understand it, you need to think about how it plays out in a lot of different contexts, right? You need to think about what it really means in practice. And art, stories, but literature, but also other forms of art, I think, are an indispensable means to doing this, both with ethical truths like this and also with other metaphysical truths, views about what kind of world we're in.
So I guess part of the discussion, and as it progresses, I don't necessarily mean this discussion in particular, but obviously I'm not an enemy of reason by any stretch of the imagination, but I do see that it's hard for people who promote reason as the fundamental mechanism to distinguish between reason and the generation of algorithms. And you can say, well, my concept of reason extends beyond the generation of algorithms, and fine, but then my question would be, well, exactly what are the mechanisms by which reason functions when what it's doing isn't generating algorithms?
So here Jordan is reaching for an answer to how is it that people are creative. And he's right to think that this is a mystery. And our objectivist philosopher is about to agree with him that this indeed is a mystery. Now, Jordan wants to say, or seems to want to say, that reason should be narrowly construed as something like logic, that it's merely the sterilized way of speaking about science, or coming to arrive at conclusions such as happens in mathematics, that it is not to do with creativity, that we understand reason really well. And our objectivist philosopher is about to say something along the lines of, well, we don't understand it. It includes more than your narrow conception. He'd be right about that, but I think his umbrella becomes a little bit too broad.
Because algorithms aren't enough, and we know that, right? Which is why we don't have expert diagnostic systems, for example. So then the reason starts to look something like metaphor, it starts to look something like narrative, and then I start thinking, yeah, but that's not exactly the Enlightenment concept of reason. So we're starting to move into a different domain. And
well,
so
there's more than just algorithms and metaphor and narrative. I think, first of all, one thing reason can do is come up with metaphors and narratives. But there's more than just those three things. I also think there's the formation of abstract principles. I don't think what Newton did in writing the Principia was coming up with algorithms. There are algorithms in it, or things you can algorithmatize about how to prove certain things. But the act of forming the concept inertia, that's not exactly, that's something else. And I think it's
inertia might be an algorithm.
Yeah,
but the act of coming up with it is something. Yes.
And I think there's a whole and underexplored area of philosophy and maybe cognitive psychology, thinking about what are these acts of reason? How does reason function? How is it that we can go from the kind of information we have in perception to a more and more sophisticated understanding of the world? And I mean, I've written some on this. Other people have. I don't know how much I should try to explain here, but I can plug.
Yeah, so here we have the idea that reason is broad, that it includes a whole raft of different processes that might be regarded in a Popperian view as error correction mechanisms. Now, in both of them agreed then that there's this mystery to do with creativity. Now, the fact that we don't understand how knowledge is created, how it is we're able to generate explanations about the world, this is really interesting. And Jordan indeed invokes, often in his talks, artificial intelligence and how people who program artificial intelligence have great difficulty in trying to program the senses of especially the robots, the embodied robots that he likes to talk about, in order for them to distinguish objects out there in the world, because he's fond of saying there are an infinite number of ways in which one can interpret the world, and postmodernists would say that given that fact, then therefore there's no privileged way of interpreting the world. And Jordan's opinion is, of course, that there are some ways that work and some ways that don't work, and the great difficulty in artificial intelligence is trying to place values into the artificially intelligent systems such that they're able to have a value system which enables them to determine what's going to work and what doesn't. Okay, that's one issue, and it's important to know that we're hinting there at there's something very unusual about people. People are able to generate explanations, they're able to have values, they're able to figure out what works in the world, but how it is that we're able to create these explanations in the first place at the moment is a complete mystery. We don't know what it is. We know that we have knowledge and that we're able to come up with new knowledge. It must be the case that the new knowledge that we come up with is some kind of modification to the existing knowledge that we have. When we look at specific examples in the history of science, such as Einstein coming up with an improvement over the existing theory of gravity, such that it completely undermined the previous existing theory of gravity, it didn't seem to be a mere modification. It wasn't just that Einstein took Newton's universal theory of gravitation, which was the inverse square law, and then tweak it a little bit. It didn't become an inverse 2 to the power of, it didn't become f equals g m1 m2 over r to the power of 2.00001 or something like that. Okay, it was a complete change in conception about how gravity worked. How? How did he come up with this completely new theory? It doesn't appear like it was a modification of the existing theory of gravity, but it must have been a modification of something. And indeed, it used existing theories of geometry. It used some of Galilean relativity. It used some concepts that were already there in electricity and magnetism. Somehow, the genius of Einstein was able to move beyond the theories that existed and to change them in a way that wasn't completely foreign to people. After all, if it was completely foreign to people, it would have taken much longer for it to have caught on to the degree that it is, such that it's actually now informing technology, such that we know that it must contain truth, given that it works. But the process whereby Einstein came up with the theory in the first place doesn't appear to be some logical process, which is why I sometimes interpret Popper's book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, as being itself a question. Was there a logic of scientific discovery? And I've always thought, no, there's not. There's no recipe that one can follow in order to gain scientific truth. There is a logic to follow, to some extent, when we want to whittle away false claims from true claims, or false claims from claims yet to be shown false. This is what the experimental method is about. This is what criticism is about. This is how the refutation in conjecture and refutation earns its keep. That there are useful strategies to employ, no matter what the domain you're interested in, whether it's mathematics, science, history, your own personal life, where the correct application of criticism will enable you to figure out what is a better compared to a worse course of action. But the conjecture part of that, the conjecture side of the coin, is very, very hard to articulate if you want to know what the rules are in order to come up with a good conjecture. Once you've got a conjecture, we've got some good ideas about what to do with it. But arriving at the conjecture in the first place is very difficult. And it's even more difficult to explain, I would argue. We don't have a theory of how conjectures are formed or how creativity works. And this is what the present discussion between Jordan and his interlocutors seems to be focused on. And it's a little bit of a stumbling block, as it should be. I think it's misguided in many, many ways, not least because they don't see knowledge creation as a process of conjecture and then correcting errors. Because that's what the application of reason really should be considered as. It's an attempt to correct errors in theories you've already guessed.
I have a chapter called Conceptualization and Justification in a book called Concepts and Their Role in Knowledge that gives my sense of what reason does here.
See, because the other thing that's come up among the cognitive scientists in particular, and also the robotics types, is as people, and this is Rodney Brooks in particular, who invented the Roomba, by the way, but who's an absolute, well, it's a major accomplishment because the Roomba doesn't have a brain, but it operates intelligently. Like, it's a major accomplishment that.
This is a minor point. I mean, we can pass over it without comment, but I'm a pedant, and so let's linger here for a moment. The Roomba doesn't have a brain, but it is intelligent. Now, this is a bias. If we want to call a brain that bit of wetware that exists inside of skulls of mammals or other vertebrates, very well. However, if you want to think about these issues in a non-parochial way, better to just think of a brain as some bit of hardware consisting of a processor and memory upon which a program can run, which enables an organism or a robot to find its way through the world. Now, in the case of people, many people know my views on this. People have a special kind of program that runs on that brain hardware, and that's called the mind. And the mind is that entity in the universe which is able to generate explanations. It's synonymous with being a person. It's a general intelligence. It's a universal explainer. All of these things mean basically the same thing. A mind is a very special program, but program nonetheless. A brain is a computer. It's a kind of computer that organisms use, but there is nothing in terms of the hardware that makes it impossible in principle not to capture every single capacity of it in a silicon-based computer.
Brooks actually reconstructed how artificial intelligence robotics engineers were conceptualizing intelligence, and he thought of it as something much more embodied rather than conceptual. So the Roomba is actually the consequence of very, very high level thinking about the relationship between reason and action in the world. Like, one of the things that the more sophisticated cognitive psychologists have been wrestling with is the fact that a lot of what we thought of as abstract reason is actually something that's more dependent on embodiment than we'd ever possibly conceived, right? And so the idea of disembodied reason, which is also, I would say, an Enlightenment concept, seems to be lacking. It's lacking in functionality. You have to be embodied. And the thing to me is that an embodied reason looks to me a lot more like the hero of a story than it looks like disembodied reason.
Well, I think this is a straw man. I just can't see the argument for anyone, Enlightenment or otherwise, suggesting that disembodied reason is a thing. That in some sense you can have reason that flies completely free of the mind in some way. The mind can't be disembodied. This is religious type thinking. Reason is the process of attempting to find errors in your existing theories. That's it. And it's a thing that people do. It's not a thing that can be done by any other kind of entity in the universe. Now, when I say people, of course I mean artificial general intelligence, aliens if they're out there, but people. People need to reason in order to figure out what's true from what's false, or what's beautiful from what's ugly, and so on. Reason, to me, is synonymous with a critical attitude.